Approved. Microsoft can buy Activision. Microsoft today got the approval, the sign off, the go ahead to close its deal to buy Activision in the EU. Now, this was expected, but still, this is a cataclysmic bombshell from Microsoft because this is so much good news after what happened in the CMA and also what's being challenged in the United States that Microsoft has one major market now saying, look, you can go ahead and buy Activision. However, there are things that Microsoft has to do, and the report that came out sheds a lot of light into how Microsoft and the EU looked at this deal. So let's dive into these hot off the press details with first the big news. This is directly from the EU. It says mergers, commissions. The commission clears acquisition of Activision Blizzard by Microsoft subject to conditions. Those conditions are very important. But first, let's dive into the actual report and what was pulled out. And I've got some information here. There'll be a link in the description to the full write-up, but these are some of the highlights that I found interesting sort of as my first read through. So, according to the EU, Microsoft would have no incentive to refuse to distribute Activision games to Sony, which is the leading distributor of console games worldwide, including the European Economic Area, the EEA, where there are 4 Sony PlayStation consoles for every Microsoft Xbox bought by gamers. So that is a 4-to-1 ratio. Now, granted, they say PlayStation consoles, not specifically the latest gen, but overall, I would believe all consoles. Indeed, Microsoft would have a strong incentive to continue distributing Activision's games via devices as popular as Sony's PlayStation, which has sort of been Microsoft's argument. They're like, look, we're the underdog. PlayStation outsells us by a significant margin, and by bringing this gaming IP in-house, it would be crazy to not put it on Sony, because how would we ever recoup our nearly $70 billion dues that we are trying to spend for this company, or companies, I guess, depending on how you want to describe it. Next up, the EU says even if Microsoft did decide to withdraw Activision games from PlayStation, this would not significantly harm the competition in the console market. Even if Call of Duty is largely played on console, it is less popular in the EEA than other regions of the world, and is less popular in the EEA within its genre compared to other markets, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, even without being able to offer the specific games, Sony could leverage its size, extensive games catalog, and market position to fend off any attempt to weaken its competitive position. Again, keep in mind, much of this was really posed as Sony versus Microsoft, but that is not necessarily the case. Sony was trying to just protect itself, and this is the EU saying, look, the EU is not here to protect Sony. Sony is only vested in its own interest, and the EU is vested in the consumer's interest. And from a consumer perspective, the EU has decided that, hey, even if Call of Duty was not available on the PlayStation would indeed have enough strong catalog to survive and be just fine. Moving on, the EU comes and says, even without this transaction, Activision would not have made its games available for multi-game subscription services, as this would cannibalize sales of its individual games. Therefore, the situation for third-party providers of multi-game subscription services would not change after the acquisition of Activision by Microsoft. Keep in mind, Microsoft went on a brilliant and a very large PR campaign where they were inking 10-year deals with just about anybody who had a pulse, other than Sony, for that matter, that they would bring their content to that service. That is the big thing that Microsoft kept pushing through. We've talked about it on this channel time and time again, but it was so vitally important at the end of the day to getting this transaction approved. But we'll get to the remedies that Microsoft must adhere to in the near future in just a couple seconds here. So going on, they also say the acquisition would harm competition in the distribution of PC and console games via cloud gaming streaming services, an innovative market segment that could transform the way many gamers play video games. Despite its potential, cloud game streaming is very limited today. The commission found that popularity of Activision's games could promote its growth. Instead, if Microsoft made Activision games exclusive to its own cloud game streaming service, Game Pass Ultimate, and withheld them from rival game services, it would reduce the competition in the distribution of games via cloud game streaming. So, in a nutshell, what is this saying? I believe this is because Microsoft said, look, we will put this on other platforms. We will not make it exclusive to our own Game Pass Ultimate cloud game streaming service. This is actually a net win for the market because other cloud gaming services, which again, we just talked about, Microsoft signed multiple deals, are now going to have access to this catalog for at minimum of 10 years based on those agreements. And so again, The EU is like, look, we're thinking about these titles where if they were exclusive to one way or another, that would potentially harm this, but because Microsoft is going to buy them and then make them available everywhere, that is actually a pretty big net win. So jumping into one of the last points here that I'm bringing up, if Microsoft made Activision games exclusive to its own cloud game streaming service, Microsoft could also strengthen the position of its Windows in the market for PC operating systems as well. This could be the case should Microsoft hinder or degrade the streaming of Activision games on PCs, operating systems, and other than Windows. So this is the EU pointing out another clause, and granted, this is not all in favor of Microsoft. They're pointing out that how Microsoft could potentially leverage the streaming services and Activision to really harm the competition, and so they're pointing out here, again, just other ways that Microsoft could degrade the experience for the consumer, which leads to the remedies that were basically approved and that Microsoft must adhere to. So, to address the competition's concerns identified by the Commission in the market for the distribution of PC and console games via cloud gaming streaming services, Microsoft has offered the following competition license committees with a 10-year duration, a free license to consumers in the EEA that would allow them to stream via any cloud gaming service of their choice all current and future Activision, Blizzard, PC, and console games for which they have a license. So this basically means you can stream this stuff for free. I think we're going to have to learn a little bit more about what exactly that means. Like, does that mean that if you're paying, or you're not paying, I should say, for a cloud streaming service, that you could stream it for free? I think there's going to be some reading between the tea leaves here, but that is something we must pay attention to. And also a corresponding free license to cloud gaming streaming services providers to allow EEA-based gamers to stream any Activision, Blizzard, PC game, or console games. So those are the two primary remedies. There is more information that Microsoft will have to kind of dig through and really understand. But at a high level, the things that Microsoft has initially proposed, or not initially, but proposed and then walked through and then got approval for, are being accepted by the EEA, the EU. And that is what matters most. So what happens next is still a little bit dicey. So now Microsoft has one major entity saying, look, you can buy this company as long as you agree to these terms, which Microsoft happily will agree to. That, right? These are things that they propose. They say things we can do, things that will happen. So we'll have to wait and see how those specific remedies materialize, right? Because it's one thing to propose and say, this is what we're going to enable, such as those free streaming and all that. And then Microsoft actually has to put that into play, right? It has to make that available, make that, live up to that agreement. Now, the other things that have to be considered right now is they're dealing with the CMA, where Microsoft has hired lawyers and they're fighting that in the UK. The other massive market is obviously here in the US. Now, with the EU backing and approving, I shouldn't say backing, but approving the transaction based on these remedies, it does put some favor towards the limelight on Microsoft's ability to get this through in the US. Because if the EU approves it, the US, while not the same entity, is more likely, in my opinion, to agree to it. Keep in mind that Microsoft is going up against the FTC, not Sony. A lot of people keep saying, well, Sony's going to get hurt. Well, it's not the FTC and it's not the EU's position to protect Sony. That is not their intent. And so that is pretty much what the EU came out and said. Look, the consumer at the end of the day looks like they might actually benefit from this by Microsoft guaranteeing 10 years, bringing it to other cloud streaming platforms. It's going to do good things for the consumer at the end of the day, at least on paper, how everything is proposed. Sorry, Sony, it's not our motive to protect Call of Duty on your platform. That being said, the EU also pointed out, like, they're not going to pull it from PlayStation. That's not going to happen either. So the question becomes, will the US see it in the same light as the EU? Logically, you would think yes. Or are they going to go the CMA route, the UK entity? Important to point out, too, that the EU also really focused heavily in on cloud game streaming. That was a big focus after pointing out that PlayStation has been outselling the console at the Xbox console roughly 4-1 over, both products' life cycles. So the console sales, both in the UK and the CMA, or the CMA and the EU, do not appear to be the actual issue. They're mostly focusing on cloud streaming, which will be curious to see if that is also where the US focuses, mostly because it doesn't seem, but it is absolutely the emerging market that may or may not materialize. We don't know if in 10 years cloud gaming is going to be the thing. There's a lot of evidence that says, maybe not. Maybe localized gaming will be it. Maybe things like the ROG Ally and Steam Deck are the better way. We will find out, but either way, the regulatory bodies are concerned with streaming, and the EU has said, Microsoft, you are doing the right thing here, and we think this is going to work, and this is going to be better for the consumers. The question becomes, will the US see it that way? So we don't know that answer, and we won't know it for some time, but Microsoft is going to give it a big, hearty fight, just like they did in the EU. And so as we learn more about this agreement and everything that's going on with Microsoft, Xbox, Activision, and all that, make sure to keep it subscribed here, because the only BS on this channel is me.